Brexit, Dunkirk and the enemy within. Between the 26th of May and the 4th of June 1940, the little ships of Dunkirk, about 850 private boats, sailed from Ramsgate in England to Dunkirk in France as part of Operation Dynamo, helping to rescue more than 336,000 British and French soldiers who were trapped on the beaches at Dunkirk during the Second World War. The nation rallied to save its own. Ordinary people took events by the scruff of the neck and made something happen. Ordinary people with boats, from large boats to tiny little fishing tubs. It seems to me that that is precisely what we have to do again, if we are to rescue ourselves from the enemy in Europe. Only now we have two enemies, one in Brussels and one at home, our own government and establishment. We are fighting a war on two fronts. Brexit was meant to be when the government rescued us from Brussels. That is what we voted for, and although you wouldn't think so, we won. Instead, it has sunk all our boats and left us drowning. In fact, it's pushing us into the water in the hope that we do drown, and it's doing it with some success. March the 29th should have been a glorious Dunkirk rescue, of returning freedom to our shores, sovereignty, control of our own lawmaking, our own borders, our own jurisdiction for trade and fishing rights, our farming regulations, our manufacturing aspirations, stopping the Islamification of the UK. Now, at best, it feels like a surrender to yet more slavery. Like Dunkirk, it will be ordinary people who make the rescue attempt, if there is to be one. Now, it's important that we remind ourselves just how long this has been going on. Jean Monnet, French economist, was one of the founding fathers of the EU in the 1950s. His plan was to centralise power. Democracy is the best thing we've come up with in Western civilization, but it's unruly and unpredictable. If the people don't like a government, they can kick it out. This is a good thing, but not for Monnet and his cronies. Monnet thought, how can you plan long-term if the people, that's us, fickle old us who don't always toe the party line, keep changing things? So, with his band of pirates, he planned the EU, which would slowly, step by step, law by law, inch by inch, claw power away from sovereign governments and establish a cabal of unelected and therefore unmovable technocrats. It was simply sold as a trade deal, the common market, but it was delivered as a wholesale takeover of nation states. There was a prurient insistence that the EU would stop infighting between European nations. Perhaps some naive people believed it. In fact, it delivered what war couldn't, German hegemony. As Peter Hitchens says, the EU is simply the continuation of German power by other means. It also allowed European nations to concentrate their military energies on bombing the crap out of non-European countries like Iraq and Syria, while the EU buried its peaceful Gorgon-like head in the sand. And there are 100 ways of destroying peoples and nations. Ask many Greeks and Italians, and now us in the UK. So you might call it peace, but I wouldn't. The body bags and graves are just in different places, and a different means of destroying peoples and cultures and histories has been invented. So the EU was supposed to stop nationalism spilling over into violence. The trouble is, nationalism has now become a dirty word. It's associated with ideas of racial superiority, violence and small-mindedness. Like so much in our language, the word has been perverted by an intransigent and morally high-handed left. Let's remind ourselves that people like Nelson Mandela and Gandhi were nationalists in the sense that they believed in a free and proud sense of nationhood, a pride in culture and a sense of belonging. These things matter. Being a someone usually means being a somewhere, and that's what Brexiteers wanted to reclaim. We voted to try and claw back a sense of belonging before the country is taken from us altogether. Now, you can believe in a national culture and be a good European. I'm a European. I love Europe and grew up with a rich sense of its diversity and fascinating collection of histories. And it's because I love Europe, I want us to leave the EU and for the whole monstrous edifice of the EU to be razed to the ground and buried. In fact, the very term European Union is an offence to language. It isn't European. It's a cabal of unelected, self-serving bureaucrats lining their pockets and trying to bully everyone into submission. And it isn't a union, it's a gang of thieves and liars. Let's remind ourselves who the enemy is again. It's the EU and it's the enemy within. It's most certainly our politicians. If anyone votes in future for the main three parties, then nothing will change. The enemy is also mainstream media. If anyone continues to watch the BBC or pay their licence fee, which is simply a tax, or watch Channel 4 or ITV, then nothing will change. If you read or, God forbid, actually buy mainstream newspapers like The Guardian, then nothing will change. The enemy is also our universities that have become, in the social sciences and liberal arts, and to some extent the sciences, ideologically driven battery farms where political correctness is the only currency allowed. If we don't fight that, nothing will change. Millions of people are disillusioned with our establishment in a way I've never seen before in my lifetime. But, and here's the point, they want us to be disillusioned with them, because when you're disillusioned, you lose energy. You get worn down, you become passive, you think, what's the point? And give up and crawl back to what could well become a ghetto that's no longer part of a country but a speck of nothing much on a landmass that has lost its history and its culture and its freedoms. So it's desperately important that people let their disillusionment turn to anger, because anger is an energy, and we have to stop the destruction of the UK as we know it and the destruction of Europe. There are people who are unafraid to speak out, and they're all outsiders. That's how you know they're on your side. They're all hated by the establishment, which spends most of its time trying to close them down. Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson, George Galloway, Tommy Robinson, Peter Hitchens, David Icke, Nigel Farage, Nigel Batten. Now, some of these people don't always agree with each other, and they don't even like each other. They're all very different in temperament and outlook, but that doesn't matter. We have to join up the dots and see whatever their difference is, they are all on the side of free speech, of democracy, of reclaiming control of our borders and leaving the poisonous carcass of the EU. Now that's a lot of common ground. It's the most important common ground. And we also have our own voices. And the more the establishment tries to silence us, the more we have to speak out in our homes, workplaces, the pub, the football match, public meetings, in private conversations. Now this has been coming for a very long time. There's a good film, not much seen. It's called Heartland, made in 1989 and starring Anthony Hopkins as a Welsh dairy farmer. Remember, 1989, 30 years ago. His family has owned the land and kept dairy cows for generations. His sons want him to modernise. Against his better judgment, he eventually agrees, and they take out a huge loan to modernise the whole farm and remortgage the house. So this is a time when the EU was systematically destroying British agriculture, and when the banks and the establishment and the globalist power mongers were saying it was good to borrow as much as you can and keep expanding. It's all going to be wonderful. But it's not. And the farmer loses everything. While his family are demonstrating against the EU in London, he gets his shotgun and he takes 2 visiting EU bureaucrats hostage. And he locks them in his father's old derelict cottage. He puts 2 newborn calves in with them. He says to keep them warm, and he provides them with food. He scares these 2, but then he lets them go. And the last few scenes are of him tending his remaining few cows and being arrested by armed police. He takes a last look at the land before he is taken to prison. He looks at his hands and says, "You will never work again." The thing is, this farmer understands intuitively who the enemy is. It's the bureaucrats, the suits, the faceless cowards who talk of globalization but happily destroy lives and businesses and families. And this was made 30 years ago, a forgotten piece of popular culture that hits the nail right on the head. It's probably a film that would not be made now. It doesn't carry the right message. It doesn't show diversity and inclusion and equality of outcome and all the other crap that is forced on us by a mealy-mouthed media and mainstream culture. We have to keep that shotgun spirit alive. That means constantly questioning the official narrative. It means insisting that we discuss the important things: the loss of free speech, the spread of Islam, the masking of human truths with a spurious off-the-shelf identity politics. It means we challenge social media, which closes down opinions that aren't deemed politically correct, whilst they feign diversity. We are told that our world is opening up, but it's shrinking horribly, and pretty soon we won't be able to breathe, let alone speak. And we'll sink and drown before we even get to Dunkirk.